Okay, so hello and thank you for joining us today. My name is Yongki Hong and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today's webinar will focus on TM visa sponsorship and requirements. I'll be covering the first half of the session, and then our firm's another senior associate, Dustin Saldarriaga, will take over the second half. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full service immigration law firm, and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, and any types of employment-based or family-based green card cases. That said, we are especially well known for our excellent work with the TM visas, and we have built a very strong reputation in this area. We have processed hundreds of TM visas, and many of them were complicated cases, and have worked with many employers who did not even have experience with the TM visa processes. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools. A copy of a PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, a link where you can download the guidelines with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for additional webinars, and another link to a webinar recording on YouTube. We definitely encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration related videos. And lastly, a link where you can set up a private consultation with our team. Finally, for any questions, please type them into chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of presentation. And with that, let's get started. So TMB probably uh
Yonki, I think your sound may be going out. Think, do you have another microphone you might be able to use? No. Okay, no problem. Um, if you want, you can try logging out and back in, and I can go over the requirements while you're doing that, if that works. Okay. So while Yonki is logging out and back in, I'll continue going over the TN visa requirements. The important thing to keep in mind for the TN visa is that it is specific to nationals of Canada or Mexico, and that means that you need a passport from one of these two countries. It's okay if you were not born in one of these two countries. So if you were born in India, for example, and you naturalized in Canada, so now you have a Canadian passport, you meet the citizenship requirement. And this is because the TN visa was founded under NAFTA, so the treaty between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And the idea there being to facilitate movement of workers between those three countries. Yonki, do you want to test out your microphone again? Okay, no problem. So you need to be coming to... Oh, Yonki, we can go to the previous slide. Yonki, can you hear me okay? Let me see real quick. All right, so I am going to share the presentation. Sorry for the interruption. Let me go ahead and get this going. All right, let's just give Yonki a moment here. Okay, so here we go. I'm just pulling up the presentation so that I can screen share. right. And let's go ahead and share that. Okay. Excellent. Okay, so you should all be able to see the presentation, but please let me know through the chat or the Q&A box if you cannot see the presentation. So let's go back to what are the TN visa requirements. So I explained the citizenship requirement. You need to have a passport from Canada or Mexico, and you need to actually be coming to the United States to work in one of the TN professions. So what do I mean by a TN profession? During this presentation, I'm going to be referring to the TN regulations quite a bit. So if you are at your computer, go ahead and open Google and Google search TN regulations. We don't usually do this for our presentations on other visas, but for the TN, the regulations are actually quite clear and really important to the TN. So if we pull up the TN regulations, you scroll down, you start to see a list of professions. It starts with accountant, and then architect, computer systems analyst, and the list goes on. Economist, you have dentist, dietitian, you have agriculturalists, animal breeders. So you need to be coming to the U.S. to work in one of these listed professions. There are dozens of listed professions, as you can see if you're looking at the regulations, but there are also many professions that are not listed. So for example, marketers are not listed in the TN regulations. And so if you're coming to the U.S. to work as a marketer, you unfortunately would not be able to do that. So let's go to the next requirement. You need to have the required qualifications to practice the listed profession. So again, looking at the regulations, let's take an example. Let's say that you want to come to the US to work as an economist. So you look at the regulations and you see there that for an economist, you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. That is the only way that you can qualify for a TN visa as an economist, is to have a baccalaureate degree or a licenciatura degree. You cannot qualify as an economist based on experience, for example. If we instead, though, look at management consultants, we see you can qualify based on having a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or the equivalent professional experience. So for a management consultant, you can qualify based on experience. So that's what we mean here on the slide when it says you must have the required qualifications to practice that profession. We're not talking about what the U.S. employer wants. We're talking about what the qualification is in the regulations. Next, you must have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the U.S. So the TN visa is not a visa that you use to come to the U.S. to look for a job opportunity. You actually do already need to have a job offer, and part of the application, we'll talk about this a little later, you actually need a letter from that U.S. employer that details exactly what you're going to be doing in the U.S. So you actually do need a firm job offer in the U.S. before you apply for the TN visa. Now, I mentioned that the employer letter is going to talk about the job duties you're going to perform in the U.S. So that leads us to the next bullet. In the job, you must be employed to engage in professional activities consistent with the listed profession. So what that means is if you are, for example, applying for a TN visa to come to the U.S. to work as an economist, you actually need to be working as an economist. You cannot come in as an economist and then work as a marketer. Again, marketers are not a TN occupation. You need to work as an economist. So what does the government think that an economist does? This is going to lead us to our next resource. I focused on before on the regulations. The next important resource to know, and again, if you're at your computer, I recommend you Google this, is the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH for short. So if you Google OOH economist, it's going to lead you to the Occupational Outlook Handbook page for economists. The Occupational Outlook Handbook is a publication that's issued by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a part of the U.S. Department of Labor. And this is an incredible resource. It really lists many professions on OOH. And one of the things they do for each profession, if you click the tab at the top that says what they do, it lists what economists do. So it has job duties. Economists typically do the following. They research economic issues related to education, the labor force, etc. They conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that data using mathematical models, interpret and forecast trends, etc. So if you're applying for a TN visa as an economist, for example, you need to be doing job duties that are aligned with what is in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. The important thing to know is the Occupational Outlook Handbook is basically the government explaining what it thinks certain professions do. So to meet that requirement, you do want to make sure your job duties are aligned. Your job duties don't need to be verbatim. They don't need to be copied and pasted from the OOH, but they should be aligned. They should be consistent. A majority of your job duties should be similar to those that are listed here in the OOH. And finally, you see bolded on the bottom, the final bullet, the degree must match the job description. This is a very common question that comes up. I said before, if we stay on the example of economists, that the only way to qualify as an economist is with a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. So more specifically, it's a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree in economics or a related field related to economics. And again, that's specific to economists. But basically, when you're qualifying based on a degree, your degree needs to be related to the job you're coming to the U.S. to perform. So if you are coming to the U.S. as a mathematician, you can qualify only based on your degree, so it needs to be a degree related to mathematics. That could be statistics, that could be related, could be physics, could be a related topic. But one very important thing to know about this requirement is there is a spectrum. So let's say you're trying to qualify as an economist based on your degree. It's the only option you have. And let's say you studied economics in school. That is clearly going to meet the requirement. If you have an economics degree and you're qualifying based on your degree, that is going to meet the requirement. However, what if you got your degree in finance? That is a related degree. So what we tend to do in those cases is we tend to look at the transcript, and we'll look at each and every course, and we will focus on and highlight, and in the employer letter we'll actually talk about how the applicant, even though their degree is in finance, they took a number of economics courses, and we'll actually list those economics courses that the person completed. So that's probably going to be fine. The other thing that you can do is use the Occupational Outlook Handbook, because before we're talking about the tab, what they do, there's another tab on the Occupational Outlook Handbook called How to Become One. So if we click on that tab, we see here under Education, candidates who have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or mathematics may qualify for some entry-level economist positions. So that is a great piece of information to use if you have a related degree, especially a degree in statistics or math, and you're trying to qualify as an economist. Here you have the government itself saying that related degrees in statistics or math can qualify you for these jobs. But what if your undergraduate degree is, say, in French, and you're trying to qualify as an economist? Usually that is not going to be approved, but there are certain ways that you can strengthen your application. Some of the things we've done in the past in these situations is, first of all, to go through the transcript, like I said before. Even if you majored in something like French or the humanities, you may have still taken a number of courses in, for example, economics. You may have written a thesis on a topic related to economics. You may have done independent research on economics. in the past, we have gotten letters from the department chair at the university where they will talk about the coursework that the person performed that's related, and the author will actually say that the coursework the applicant completed prepared them to work as an economist. So things like that are ways that you can be approved even if your degree is not related. But usually you do need a related degree in order for it to meet the qualification if you're qualifying based on a degree. If you're applying for a job or you have a job offer that where you have multiple ways to satisfy it, so you may qualify based on a degree or experience. If your degree is not related, you might want to try qualifying based on the experience component. But if you don't have that option, you may need to think strategically about how to qualify based on your degree alone. This slide is just a screenshot of the Economist OOH page that I was referring to. Here you can see I was referring to this tab, what they do. This tab, how to become one, is where I found information on related degrees. So spend time on the Occupational Outlook Handbook regarding your specific profession that you want to fill in the U.S. And again, that profession needs to be listed in the TN regulations. So one of the most common questions we get from people, both employers and applicants for TN visas, is, do I need sponsorship? Does the U.S. employer need to sponsor me for this role? The answer we generally give in response to that question is no, you do not need sponsorship. And the reason we say that is that the meaning of sponsorship in U.S. immigration law is quite burdensome, and those requirements don't apply to TN visa applicants. So in U.S. immigration law, sponsorship typically means a number of things. First, the U.S. employer needs to test the labor market in the U.S. They need to advertise the job to U.S. workers who are able and willing to perform the work. And if someone in the U.S. is able and willing to perform the work, then in an employment-based green card context or an H-1B context in general, they need to stop the process of pursuing the foreign worker, and they need to go with the domestic worker. That does not apply in the TN context. Also, typically in sponsorship, the U.S. employer is required to pay what's called a prevailing wage, which is higher than the minimum wage. That is not required in the TN context. There are many other requirements that come with sponsorship that don't apply to TN. So, for example, there's no requirement to pay for travel back to the person's home country if the employment opportunity doesn't work out. So, so this is why in general we say sponsorship is not required in the TN context. For a TN, really the employer has minimal obligations. The employer in the U.S. would make a job offer to the foreign applicant. That is required. The U.S. employer needs to express in the form of a letter how long they intend to employ the person for, at what salary or wage, and basically what the job duties will be. But the employment relationship is the same as with any other employee in the U.S. It is at will. The U.S. employer can fire the foreign worker at any time. The U.S. employer does not need to test the labor market. They don't need to pay higher than the minimum wage. So the requirements on the employer are really minimal. They are not, the U.S. employer is not sponsoring a TN worker, does not have those additional requirements that would apply in the typical sponsorship context. So what requirements do apply to the U.S. employer? Basically, they need to provide a signed letter that is legitimate and honest and expresses what their intention is with this employee. And they, in good faith, should comply with what they express in that letter. But again, it really is like any other employee-employer relationship. If the U.S. employer were hiring a U.S. worker to perform the job, it would be no different. They would have a job offer letter, an employment contract, and if it just doesn't work out with the employee can generally be fired. And conversely, if the employee wants to leave, they can quit And the same relationship really mirrors the TN relationship. So real quick, on your screen you see filing for a TN at a port of entry or at a consulate. So we will talk about this in more detail as well as filing from within the U.S. For now, I'll just say there are three ways to apply for a TN visa or TN status. Um, the first way is if you're inside the U.S., you can apply through USCIS. The second way is whether you're inside the U.S. or outside the U.S., you can apply at a consulate. The third way, which is only available for nationals of Canada, is to apply at a port of entry, at an airport or a land crossing. Nationals of Mexico cannot apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Canada can. Well, again, we'll go into more detail about those differences in this slide and in the following slides. So the main difference in terms of applying as a Canadian or a Mexican is that Canadians can apply at a port of entry. Almost all of our clients who are nationals of Canada will choose this option. And the reason is it is just so straightforward, so fast. You get an immediate decision. It's relatively inexpensive, and it's easy. You just show up at the airport or you show up at the border crossing, present your TN application, have a discussion with the officer, a brief discussion, and you're on your way. If you're approved, you enter the U.S. If you're denied, you have an immediate decision, and you return home and can focus on the weaknesses in the application and apply again if you choose to do that. So applying at a port of entry is very, very easy. When a Canadian applies at a port of entry, if they're approved, they will be given an I-94 in TN status, showing TN status for up to 3 years. 3 years is the maximum period of time for TN status. And that also applies to nationals of Mexico. So whether you're Canadian or Mexican, when you enter the U.S. in TN status, the maximum period of time you'll be given is 3 years. Now, you can renew a TN visa or TN status indefinitely as long as you remain eligible. You would just need to apply to extend your status or apply to renew your visa and then leave and come back into the U.S. But you can renew your TN visa or status indefinitely. So I said that most of our Canadian clients apply at a port of entry, but not all do. One of the main reasons that a national of Canada would apply at a consulate is if their spouse or their child is not a national of Canada. If that's the case, then the spouse or child is still eligible for a TN dependent visa called a TD visa, but they cannot be processed at a port of entry. So because the child or the spouse would need to go to a consulate for a TD visa, again, because they don't have a Canadian passport, the principal applicant would typically join them and go through the process. The other situation in which a Canadian would not apply at a port of entry is if they're already in the U.S., they don't want to leave, they don't want to travel, and they want to file domestically. Then they may apply through USCIS. But really that option, we'll talk about this more in a few minutes, that option is more expensive, and it is going to take at least 2 weeks to get a decision. So it's more expensive, it takes more time. As a result, most of our Canadian clients are going to opt for applying at a port of entry. So what about nationals of Mexico? Nationals of Mexico, if they are outside the U.S., they must apply at a U.S. consulate. They do have the option of applying for a 4-year TN visa, which is really convenient. We generally do recommend that you pay the additional fee to get a 4-year visa rather than a shorter visa. It is very convenient. Each time they enter the U.S., just like Canadians, they're given 3 years of status and TN status. There are certain cases where they can renew their TN visa through mail, but the consulate will let them know that, will let you know. So basically you'd submit your application online, the DS-160, and then the consulate will let you know that you qualify to renew by mail. It's not something you request up front. You do need to be in Mexico, though. Even if you're renewing by mail, you cannot mail your passport from the United States to Mexico and then get it back in the United States. You need to actually be in Mexico, mail your passport to the consulate, receive it back, and then come back into the U.S. That's how that works. So I mentioned before that there are dozens of TN professions. We talked about economists. We talked briefly about mathematicians. There's accountants, dentists. You really have literally dozens of professions. Not all of the professions are equally challenging to be approved for. And there are two professions in particular that are challenging, and those are management consultants and economists. These are challenging for very different reasons, so let's talk through why they're challenging. Management consultants. If you remember when we were talking about the regulations, management consultants did not need to qualify based on a degree. Management consultants can qualify also based on experience. And if we actually read what the requirement is, it says management consultants can qualify based on a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience as established by a statement or a professional credential attesting to 5 years of experience either as a management consultant or in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So this is the management consultant category is one of the few categories that does not require a degree. All right. Almost every other category is either going to require a degree or a professional license, which in and of itself usually requires a degree. For example, lawyer. So a lawyer can qualify based on a law degree or membership in a state or provincial bar. But to be a member of a state or provincial bar, you typically will need that degree. Or you'll need to do an apprenticeship that takes a number of years. So management consultant really is one of the few categories that if you just do not have a degree, you can apply for. And the government knows that applicants know this, and that people, even if they don't meet the management consultant requirements, even if they are not coming to the U.S. to actually work as a management consultant, if they don't have a degree, they may be applying in that category. So the government scrutinizes all management consultant applications to make sure that the person is not just applying in that category because they don't have a degree, that they're actually coming to the U.S. to work as a management consultant. So let's talk in more detail about this because there is a spectrum. Not all management consultant applications are innately risky. Let's start with the applications that are not risky. The management consultant applications that are not risky are for those people who have been working at a management consulting firm and are coming to the U.S. to work at a management consulting firm as a management consultant. So let's say you've been at McKinsey in Mexico City and you are being transferred to McKinsey in New York City. That is not going to be a particularly challenging TN application, and the reason is you're coming to work at a management consulting firm. So what is a risky management consultant application? It's one where you're coming to the US not to work for a management consulting firm. So let me give you an example. The example I like to use is a national of Mexico has been working in the solar panel industry for a decade, and they are seen really as an expert in the manufacturing and design of solar panels. And a company in the US that does this work, they design, they manufacture solar panels, wants to hire this person, this national of Mexico, to come to the US to advise the US company on how to improve its manufacture and its design of solar panels. That is going to be a riskier management consultant application. And the reason is because the person is not coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. They're coming to work for a solar panel company. That being said, this type of application can certainly be approved. There are just certain things you need to know. The first is if you're coming to the US to work as a manager, as a consultant, the employment arrangement needs to reflect that fact. So typically, when a company hires a management consultant, they're hiring that person as a contractor. The consultant is coming in temporarily to look at a very specific problem or challenge that the company is facing. And the consultant's going to use their experience, their expertise, to advise the US company on that challenge. And then once they've done that, they leave. So when you're doing a TN application for a management consultant who's coming to the US to work for a company that's not a management consulting firm, the arrangement needs to look like that. Otherwise, the government is going to think this isn't actually a consulting agreement. This is employment. So what do you want to do? And again, this needs to reflect reality. It's not just that you frame the application this way and once you come into the US you do something completely different. The representation to the government needs to be honest and legitimate. So the arrangement, it's important in the TN application that the challenge is defined. What is the US company experiencing that they need a consultant to help with? In our example, maybe our solar panel company is struggling with increasing costs and they need this person to analyze the manufacturing process to identify ways to reduce costs, to make the process more efficient. There's your challenge. Then you need to define how the foreign national is qualified to address that challenge. So this is a person who's been working as a decade in solar panel manufacturing, and they are the ideal person to come to the US to address this challenge. You also need to think about exactly how long the person needs to be here. I said before, you can get a TN visa or status for up to 3 years. That's the maximum. But a consulting arrangement, 3 years is quite long. So it may be a good idea to say, you know what, we don't actually need this person here for 3 years to analyze our solar panel manufacturing. We only need them here for a year. And in that year, they are going to do very specific things. In months 1 through 4, they're going to analyze the manufacturing process. In months 5 through 9, they're going to create recommendations. And in months 10 through 12, they're going to make those recommendations to management and observe the implementation of them. That should all be defined in the consulting agreement. So the consultant would typically be a contractor. There would be a consulting agreement that will define how they're going to be compensated, exactly what they're going to do for the US company, and how they'll be compensated based on the deliverables that they provide to the US company. Contrast that to the US company simply saying, we are going to put this person at 40 hours a week as a W-2 employee. That's going to look suspicious because consultants rarely will become full-time W-2 employees of the company that they're consulting on behalf of. So that's what's important to keep in mind here, is that the employment arrangement needs to actually be a legitimate consulting arrangement when you're doing these TN applications for management consultants. Again, if they are coming to the US to work for a company that's not a management consulting firm. If they're coming to work for a management consulting firm, it is fine to make them a full-time W-2 employee because that's what they are. They would be coming to McKinsey to work full-time and they'd be a W-2 employee. So again, that's why working for a management consulting firm is not as risky. The last thing I'll say about management consultants is this final bullet. Unless the applicant is coming to work for a management consulting firm, the position must be supernumerary. So that is just another way of saying what I was just talking about, is that supernumerary is a non-permanent role. So it is basically an extra role at the company, exactly what a consultant would be. So it's not a position that existed before. It really is a consultant coming in, helping with something, and then leaving. They're not creating a full-time position for this person. So what about economists? Economists applications are also challenging, but for a completely different reason. And the reason is that the government issued a policy memo in 2017. It says here new policy memo. Now it's pretty old. It's 9 years old. But that policy memo in 2017 basically narrowed the definition of what the government thinks an economist does. So this should sound familiar because I was saying before that that's exactly what the Occupational Outlook Handbook does. The Occupational Outlook Handbook defines what the government thinks certain professions do. So if you're applying as an economist, you need to be especially careful that your job duties in the US are aligned with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says economists do. Now, the other aspect of this is that the government made it clear that it does not think that economists should be working as financial analysts or market research analysts. So, what that means is financial analysts, just to define very broadly, the government would define as people who are working for financial institutions to find opportunities to generate profits. So they would work at investment banks, for example, to find ways to invest funds to increase profits. Market research analysts are analyzing for the purpose of marketing goods and services for a company. And again, the government said that's not what economists do. So if you're coming to the US to do one of those two things, work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, you're going to have a really hard time being approved for a TN. You may want to look at an H-1B, an O-1, other visa options like that, but the TN is probably not going to be your best bet. By the way, there should be an Occupational Outlook Handbook page for financial analysts and market research analysts. So you can actually see what OOH or the government thinks people do in those roles, and you want to make sure you're not doing those roles if you're applying as an economist. Last point on this one is there may be a way. I mentioned other visa options like the H-1B and the O-1. There may be a way to get a TN to work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, specifically market research analyst, as a management consultant. But again, it's really important that you define the challenge the company is facing. If they're facing a marketing challenge and you are an expert in marketing and you're going to come in as a consultant for a year and help a company with its marketing, that could be a legitimate and approvable management consultant application. You just need to be very thoughtful about how you structure the application. And may go without saying, but these are the applications that are where an immigration lawyer can be most helpful. Many TN applications are quite straightforward, but I would say that for management consultants and economists, I would say it is important to have an immigration lawyer look over those cases because those applications, because they're so complex and nuanced. So let's take a step back and talk about the TN application process. I already talked about some aspects of this, namely that only Canadians can apply at a port of entry or an airport. Nationals of Mexico need to apply either at a consulate or through USCIS if they're inside the US. So let's talk about Canadians quickly and how they would apply at a port of entry. And let's take a step back in talking about this because the application packet that a Canadian would provide at a port of entry is the same application packet that a national of Mexico would provide at a consulate or that would be provided at USCIS. So the heart of a TN application is not really going to change depending on where the application is submitted. And I'll, with certain exceptions, and I'll explain those exceptions. But for Canadians who are applying at a port of entry, they would bring their application packet, which is first and foremost a letter from the U.S. employer. And that letter is going to explain who the U.S. employer is, why they need someone in this profession, how much the person is going to be paid, for how long they intend to employ this person, up to 3 years. Who the applicant is, how they're qualified for the role based on the TN qualifications, and what their job duties are going to be in the U.S. And again, those job duties need to be aligned with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says that profession does. So they're going to bring that employer letter. The applicant is going to bring that employer letter. It needs to be signed, original signature by the employer. Needs to be on the employer's official company letterhead with their contact information, the employer's contact information. That's the first item in the application packet. Next, the applicant needs to bring proof that they qualify. And again, when I say qualify, I'm talking about the TN regulations. So if the applicant is qualifying based on having a baccalaureate degree, they need to bring their original diploma showing that they have that degree. If they have a related degree and need to bring their transcripts, they're going to need certified copies of their transcripts. If they're qualifying based on experience, they need to bring original signed letters from their past employers talking about their past experience. If they're qualifying based on a professional license, they need to bring original documentation showing they have that license. Um, and of course, they would also bring their passport. But that really is the TN application. It's going to be the employer letter talking about the job in the US, as well as the applicant and how they qualify, the proof that the applicant qualifies, and the passport. By and large, that is what is in a TN application. So that application, like I said, is going to be the same at a consulate. The only difference is that at a consulate, you first file a Form DS-160, which is an online application. Then the consulate, when they're ready to interview you, they will let you know. They'll call you in for an interview, and you would bring that application packet that I described before. If you're applying from within the U.S. Through USCIS, then the employer would file a Form I-129 with USCIS. It would not be the applicant filing that. The applicant, meaning the employee, it would be the U.S. employer that signs and files the I-129. That doesn't change the responsibilities of the employer. They're the same as what I said earlier about not requiring sponsorship. It's just that it's a technical nuance. That is, it's the employer that files the application with USCIS. And the employer would submit the supporting documents, the letter from the employer, proof that the applicant qualifies. Those would all be copies, though. So with USCIS, you do not submit originals. You would submit originals at a port of entry or at a consulate. So let's move on. We've already talked about a number of tips and common pitfalls. And by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to send those in. We are nearing the end of the presentation. A few tips. It is always a good idea to call, if you're applying at a port of entry, to call the port of entry beforehand, just to make sure that you know when they're operating, if they have any unique procedures for TN applicants. Especially during the pandemic, ports of entry really did change their procedures quite a bit and would change them from week to week. So it's still a good idea to call, though. And you can find the contact information on the U.S. Customs and Border Protection website. You do want to make sure that the employer contact person who signed the employer letter, make sure that they are available at the time you are either going to your interview at the consulate or approaching the port of entry. And that's because there have been cases where the government officer will call the person who signed the letter and will just want to make sure that the job offer is legitimate. It's usually not an extensive conversation. It's usually just to make sure, again, that the job is legitimate. So it's just a good idea to let the employer know, hey, I'm going to be approaching the border tomorrow at around noon. If you could just keep your phone on you. Next, bring the diploma, official transcripts, and original signed versions of the employer letter. At the consulate and at the port of entry, they encounter a lot of fraud, and so they want to see original documents, not copies. So do try to get those original documents before you go to the port of entry or the consulate. If you're applying through USCIS, it's fine to submit copies. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa and requires a showing of non-immigrant intent. You should be prepared to show ties to your home country if you've been in the U.S. for a long time. So I said before that you can renew your TN visa or your TN status. You can extend your TN status indefinitely. There is no limit to the number of times you can renew your TN status. That being said, as long as you remain eligible. That being said, though, if you've renewed your TN 3-4 times, you're nearing a decade in the U.S. in TN status, you might start to get questions at the border or at the consulate about your intention to ultimately leave the U.S. So it is a good idea to come prepared. Have proof that you have bank accounts abroad. If you own property abroad, bring proof of that. If you have family abroad, be prepared to discuss that. Again, this is usually not an issue the first or second time you apply for TN status, but if you're extending a third, fourth time, you might get questions about this, and it never hurts to be prepared with documentation to respond to this. The TN visa is a non-immigrant visa, meaning it is temporary. You do need to intend to leave the U.S. at the end of it. It's not a green card. It doesn't lead to a green card. But again, you can renew it as long as your intention is not to pursue a green card and you remain eligible both through the TN qualifications and your employer continues to be eligible. You can renew the TN indefinitely. All right, that concludes our presentation. Thank you all for your attention. As Yongki mentioned, we will be following up with an email with a link to our YouTube channel, a link to our blog, a comprehensive guide to the TN visa, as well as this PowerPoint, as well as our contact information. So if you do have specific questions about your circumstances, do schedule a consultation. We'd be very happy to talk with you. In the meantime, stay well. We look forward to seeing you soon.